Another period we see during this intertestamental period is the Roman period from 63 BC to AD 37. Herod the Great is an important figure here from 37 to 4 BC. He became king of the Jews, and from 37 to 28 BC during his reign is known as the period of consolidation, where he got rid of the Hasmoneans. From 28 to 14 BC is the period of public works or prosperity. The greatest contributions to the Jews include a number of cities. He built the temple in 20 or 19 BC, started. It wasn't actually completed until AD 64. From 14 to 4 BC is the period of domestic troubles. Toward the end of his life, Herod became paranoid and thought everyone was after his throne, and so he killed off a wife, he killed off sons, put them to death so that he can continue to reign. And at his death, there were 3 divisions of the land. Now, the sons and successors of Herod the Great include Archelaus, the ethnarch of Judea, Samaria, and Idumea from 4 BC to 86. And we know that procurators, governors, ruled after his disposal or removal. Herod Antipas was a tetrarch, which meant a ruler of a fourth part of Galilee and Perea from 4 BC to AD 37. Jesus calls this Herod a fox. He's the one that had John the Baptist beheaded for having the wife of his brother Philip. Herod Antipas' capital was at Tiberias and was built on an ancient graveyard, so he doesn't really honor God's law to have respect for the dead and have his brother's wife. During Jesus' trial, Jesus refused to answer him, and he was deposed on his request to be king. Herod Philip was a tetrarch of northeast Palestine from 4 BC to AD 34. He's the kindest and wisest of the Herodians. His capital was at Caesarea Philippi. Other Herodian leaders and rulers include Herod Agrippa I from AD 37 to 44. He's the grandson of Herod the Great. He was educated at Rome and a friend of Emperor Caligula. He was king over Palestine, and he put James to death and he put Peter in prison back in Acts 12. He had 2 daughters. Acts 25 mentions Bernice. He also had Drusilla, and he had a son. And he dies at the end of Acts 12 of an internal illness where God strikes him down because he did not reflect or deflect the praise given to him. Herod Agrippa II from AD 50 to 70, referenced in Acts 26. His father, the Herod Agrippa I, dies when Herod Agrippa II was but 17. He had the privilege of appointing a high priest during his reign. He encouraged Jews from revolting in AD 66. Now, during this time, when we talk about the New Testament, there was a couple of Roman emperors that are especially important during the Gospels and Acts, and that's Emperor Augustus from 27 BC to AD 14. He's simply a puppet in the sovereign hand of God who declares a census to be taken that actually moves Joseph and Mary to Bethlehem for the birth of Jesus, which was a fulfillment of prophecy. And there's Emperor Tiberius from AD 14 to 37. He's the one reigning during the ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Now, during this time period, the intertestamental period, we also see the literature of Judaism has really taken shape. So the Old Testament exists in 3 linguistic forms. The original was Hebrew. The Septuagint is the Greek translation. About 80% of the New Testament references of the Old Testament comes from this Greek translation. And the Targums, which are Aramaic translations orally. There's also the Apocrypha. It wasn't part of the Hebrew Old Testament. It wasn't canonical, but part of the Septuagint. We see different parts of history like 1 Maccabees, fiction, 2 Maccabees, wisdom like the Wisdom of Solomon. There's also pseudepigrapha, which are falsely inscribed authorship. It's Jewish writings attributed to ancient hero to gain authority. There's also the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is the greatest manuscript discovery of modern times. In 1947, all the Old Testament books were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls except the book of Esther. Most of those that were found were Psalms and Deuteronomy and Isaiah, and it just so happens those are the most quoted books in the New Testament. Shows you what kind of influence they had in ancient Jewish life. The copy that was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls of Isaiah was 1,000 years older than the oldest one they had up until that time. Other ways in looking at literature of Judaism include Philo. He's the most prolific writer of Hellenistic Judaism. He reinterpreted the Old Testament to make it acceptable to Greeks by combining Hebrew Old Testament and Greek philosophy. He wrote about the Logos, the Word. But in his thought, Logos wasn't a person, but a principle. Josephus is the most important source for the history of the Jews outside the Bible. He was a Jewish historian and wrote of the origin of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. There's also rabbinic literature, which is the writings of the Pharisees. They have the Mishnah, the oral traditions that were written down. They have the Gemara, which is commentary on the Mishnah. And they have the Talmud, which is the Mishnah and the Gemara put together. During this time, we also see religious sects develop, groups develop from this intertestamental period. There's the Pharisees, which means separated ones. They numbered about 6,000 people in Jesus' day. They're the largest religious group. They were spiritual descendants of the Hasidim, and they were separated from people who they viewed as less spiritual. Now, they had a number of beliefs. They believed in exclusivism. That is, they were apart from the regular people. They believed in legalism. The oral traditions were just as important as Scripture itself. So to break one of the oral traditions was to break the law, even though it wasn't. They believed in predestination as they upheld the sovereignty of God. They believed in a highly developed spirit world of angels and demons. They believed in life after death with the bodily resurrection and believed in the coming of Messiah at least until AD 70 and the destruction of Jerusalem. And they believed in the entire Old Testament that we would call the Old Testament today was seen as Scripture. So, very influential group. Because of their beliefs, a Pharisee, it was easier for a Pharisee to become a Christian like Paul because their beliefs were similar and just carried over and saw fulfillment in Jesus. Sadducees, on the other hand, numbered about 2,000, and yet they had greater power among the Sanhedrin, the Jewish Supreme Court. We have no writings by them, but their enemies wrote of some of their beliefs, so we do know that they did not believe in angels and demons. They did not believe in the resurrection, for instance. They're descendants of the Hellenists and supporters of the Hasmoneans when they rose to power during that era. They're part of the aristocratic party with wealth and power. And their source of power was the temple. Thus, they no longer existed after AD 70. They rejected the oral law and its traditions. They accepted only the Pentateuch as authoritative, that is canonical, so only the first 5 books. And they rejected predestination, the spirit world, future bodily resurrection, future Messiah, and more. The Essenes numbered some 4,000 in Jesus' day, and they lived at Qumran and were responsible for what became known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were spiritual descendants of the Hasidim, but much more legalistic. And they referred to themselves as being of light and everyone else as being of darkness. Now, the Essenes in the Qumran community had a very simple diet. It was known for them to wear basic clothing like camel skin, like eating things like locusts and honey. They were known for practicing baptisms in their mikvahs to be cleansed when time to eat or time to study the scriptures. John the Baptist has much in common with them and comes from that area, so it's been debated as to whether or not he belonged to the Essenes at one time. There's also the Herodians, which only mention in the Gospels, this group, and they're political supporters of the Herodian dynasty. The Zealots were a militant nationalistic group wanting to gain political independence from Romans. They believed it was sin to have any group over the Jews, so they refused to pay taxes to Caesar. They're a very patriotic group, and they sparked a Jewish revolt in AD 70 when they were upset with what the Jews were doing, what the Romans were doing to Jerusalem. You also have the proselytes and God-fearers, the converts to Judaism. While a God-fearer couldn't undergo circumcision, there were 3 requirements to be a proselyte. A proselyte had to undergo circumcision, had to baptize himself, and make an offering in Jerusalem. The scribes were professional religious scholars belonging to the Pharisee party, and they were the theological experts of their day. And there's a group known as the people of the land. They're the vast majority of the people. Jesus' parents would have fallen under this. Most people would have fallen under this. This wasn't so much a religious group as just a group. They lacked the time to obey the oral law. The Pharisees saw them as sinners, and yet they upheld the Pharisees, and that was sort of their heroes, as they wanted to be more like them. And so the Pharisees had tremendous influence. And then finally, let me mention a few religious institutions in the intertestamental period. So the temple, it's mentioned many times in the Gospel and Acts. It's a spiritual center of Judaism. The first one was built by Solomon around 966 BC. It was destroyed by the Babylonians by 586 BC. It was rebuilt by Zerubbabel in 515 BC, and Herod the Great enlarged it and beautified it. It was the only place sacrifices could be offered, and the central function of it was to focus Israel's attention on God. There's also the synagogue, which meant assembly. It arose during the period of the exile as believers gathered together to worship and pray. There had to be at least 10 Jewish men in a town for them to have a synagogue, and it's centered around the study of scriptures as well as a place of fellowship. Now, the synagogue service had 6 parts to it. It had the recitation of the Shema, it had prayer, singing of the Psalms, reading and translation of the law and the prophets, a sermon, and a benediction of blessing. And then there's the Sanhedrin, the Jewish Supreme Court, consisting of 71 members and presided over by the high priest. So that helps you understand a little bit more about what was going on in the intertestamental period as we get up to the time of the opening pages of the New Testament.